Let's finally talk about the jQuery deferred object. Even after reading the documentation about it, many people are left scratching their heads. First of all, consider the load button that we've been clicking so far. Each time we clicked it, we expected something to happen. We also expected nothing to happen until we clicked it. Simply put, our expectation could be stated as, when the load button is clicked, then perform this processing. Think about that for a second. The load button click logic is actually an asynchronous process too. We have no idea how long the user will take to click the button, or if they ever will click it. Only when the click occurs do we want to run the code in the click function. The same is true for our expectation of the proceed button being enabled. Only when all content is loaded do we want the proceed button to become enabled. If the content is never loaded, we don't want the proceed button to be enabled at all. We can put this simply by stating, when all content is loaded, then enable the proceed button. Notice the way that's worded. When something happens, then do something else. That is the essence of the deferred method in jQuery. Although it may seem to be the same as using a callback function, it is quite different. We'll explore those differences in a little bit. For now, let's see a deferred in action. Notice the when and then methods. These are jQuery methods that we can use to organize our logic pattern. The when method returns a jQuery deferred object that we can make use of for later or deferred processing. The deferred object promises to notify our code upon completion of a process. We make use of that notification within the then method. This is the implementation of our expectation that was stated as, when the content is loaded, then enable the proceed button. In this sample, we're using the get method within jQuery instead of load. Although both methods make use of the core AJAX functionality within jQuery, the load method doesn't return a deferred object. The get method does. We want to make use of deferreds, so we're going to use the get method. Wait a minute. Earlier, we talked about the when method returning a deferred object. That's right. The when method will group one or more deferred processes into a single code block and make a notification of completion when all code has finished. There is no need to place subsequent AJAX calls into a callback function of a previous AJAX call. Like the load method, the get method makes use of a callback when it succeeds. Using a callback in this case is no problem. In this case, the callback is appropriate because it returns data that is used to fill the contents of the div. The deferred object won't pass control to the then clause until that content is loaded. Unlike the load method, the get method doesn't place the contents in a div automatically. This makes sense because we called it directly from the jQuery reference, $. The load method was called as part of a selected element. We'll use the callback function to load the contents, but not to determine if we should enable the proceed button. The get method takes an additional parameter that specifies the type of content we want to load. Usually, jQuery does a pretty good job of guessing the content type. We're going to remove the guesswork and pass it a parameter that states we're dealing with HTML. We can wait for as many deferreds as we want. We just separate each one by commas. Once all deferreds have resolved, the function defined in the then method is executed. Let's see this in action. We'll have to watch carefully once we click the load button. Contents 1 and 3 appeared immediately, followed shortly by content 2. Then, once all the content was loaded, the proceed button was enabled. This is exactly what we wanted to accomplish. This pattern is extensible. We can add more content by simply adding more get methods within the when method. There's no Christmas tree indent issue either. Notice how the get methods all do pretty much the same thing, but with different content and a different section. We could clean this code up quite a bit by using a single function to get the contents. Let's do that. Then we'll learn some more about the deferred. We're really close with what we've got so far. If we want to make it really extensible, however, we need to move the repeated code in each of the callbacks to a single function. Imagine if we get requirements to do a few lines of code after each content is loaded. With what we've done so far, we'd have to duplicate those few lines of code in each success callback function. We're going to make sure we have a single function to allow for easy modifications and enhancements in the future.